I'm going to be really honest with you guys. I don't know what to do with Moon Knight. I don't think the show knows what to do with Moon Knight. But I guess that makes for an interesting series, right? Welcome back to Access Blockbusters, everybody, and welcome to a look back on the 2022 Marvel MCU Disney Plus series in Phase 4 of the MCU, Moon Knight. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look back on the series starring Oscar Isaac as Mark Spector / Stephen Grant / I guess Jake Lockley, and talking about what I think about the show upon a rewatch a little bit after it has been released. It's been a while, and I wanted to take a look back to see what I thought. But before we get into the video, if you haven't subscribed to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, make sure to do so. Give this video a like and let me know in the comments down below what you think about Moon Knight. Do you love the show? Do you hate the show? I have a feeling that this is one of those shows that might have aged differently for different people. I think that some people really love the show and probably love it more now. I think some people like the show but maybe like it less now. Keep watching to see what I think about Moon Knight because I'm one of those people who quite liked the show the first time. So let's see how it fared on the second rewatch. As always, these videos are divided into 3 distinct parts. The first part is me talking about the context of the show when it came out, what I was thinking at the time, what my expectations were, and then what I thought about the show as I was watching it the first time week by week. The second part of the video will be me discussing what I liked, what I didn't like on the rewatch, and what I think about the show in general this time around. And the third part will be comparing how I thought about the show the first time versus how I think about it now. Alright, got all that? Let's talk about Moon Knight. So to kick things off, Moon Knight was a show that I thought had immense potential. From the first trailer, and I believe the show only released 1 trailer, I thought the concept was so fascinating. And look, I'm not a diehard comic book fan, so I didn't know a ton about Moon Knight, but I knew that he was a character that had so many dimensions and layers to him, and I think that there was infinite potential with a character like this. And while the Marvel Disney Plus series have been hit or miss, at least up until this point, I mean, it's fair to say that they're taking big swings, and this was another big swing from Marvel. It's getting an Oscar-caliber actor in Oscar Isaac, no pun intended, and just putting him in a role where, yes, it's superhero-y, yes, it's Marvel-y, but he's used to that kind of thing. He didn't have the best experience as Apocalypse, but I believe that this was a role, I did believe at the time, and I still do, that this was a role he could really sink his teeth into. So I was really excited. I wanted to see what the show had to offer. I wanted to see what Oscar Isaac did with the character, and I really just left my expectations open, and I think that the first couple episodes really did pique my interest because the first couple episodes set up this intriguing, tense drama thriller where you have a main character who doesn't even know where he is, who he is. I think the first episode, aside from episode 5 maybe, and even episode 5 has its ups and downs, but the ups are really high. We'll get there in a second. But episode 1 is so strong because you're setting up a mystery that is very compelling. You have a character who is struggling with this idea that he wakes up in places where he doesn't even know who he is, but then he has another personality talking to him, and there's this bird creature that's talking to him as well. Is it fair to say that episode 1 of Moon Knight is the best pilot of the MCU Disney Plus series? I think it might be, honestly. And I think some of the other ones are very strong, but episode 1 is one of the better starts to an MCU series. And look, I mean, maybe that's not high praise because it's fair to say that I think the MCU series generally start out stronger than the end. So it's still worth noting, though. I think that the first episode did an incredible job of setting up a lot of different things, the characters, the plots, the themes, the tone of the story in about 40 to 50 minutes. But the week-by-week format was interesting for Moon Knight the first time it came out because I think that each different episode had a unique flair or tone to it, so it was harder to recognize an overarching story, I think, with this show, but it was fun to watch each individual episode because each individual episode brought something new. And I think that that works very well on a first watch. But it did make the ending feel a little bit lackluster because you had all these different disparate tones and styles coming in. Like one episode, I think episode 4, was an Indiana Jones kind of style of artifact hunting. And then episode 1 was a psychological thriller. And then episode 5 was a deep exploration into trauma and dealing with pain. So all of that had such immense potential. And obviously the ending of episode 4 leading in episode 5 had so many layers of trauma and burying your trauma and mental, I don't even know what to call them, barriers, like the different dimensions, I guess, that Mark finds himself in the doctor's office and in the duat. And it worked really well to Moon Knight's advantage to kind of confuse the audience enough that it was still interesting. But then episode 6 kind of just made everything come together in a very sort of generic CGI fest where it was a crocodile against a bird and Moon Knight kind of fighting Harrow who was pointing lasers at him. So I left the show feeling a little bit underwhelmed, even though I thought it had incredible potential and I had fun with it. And while I think a lot of those things remain true on this rewatch as we transition into the second part of this video, I also think that a lot of them were magnified. And I think a lot of the negatives became far more negative to me on the second rewatch, and the positives remained fairly positive, if not even a little bit more. So let's kind of go through episode by episode and talk about things I didn't like and liked about each one, because I think that Moon Knight is a show that lends itself very well to that kind of structure. Because like I said, unlike other Disney Plus MCU shows like Falcon and the Winter Soldier or even Hawkeye, where it's one sort of overarching narrative, this show feels very segmented. And I think each episode is unique, but I don't necessarily think that's the best thing. We'll talk about that at the end. First of all, what becomes incredibly apparent is that Oscar Isaac is acting his butt off. I mean, it is incredible the way that he's able to embody this character of Stephen Grant, who, yes, has sort of a shoddy British accent, but we learn later that's very intentional because it's a created persona. And Oscar Isaac, you can tell, I mean, he never does anything just for the sake of doing it. You can tell he's putting everything into this role. Also, the opening with Harrow with the glass and issues, that's terrifying. And I think that the opening has such a great tone of disorientation, and that's what the show's going for, which is awesome because we're in the shoes of Stephen Grant to begin the series. I love Khonshu. I think that F. Murray Abraham, his voice lends itself so well to this character, and I think that the switching between Mark and Steven through the first episode, where you're not entirely sure what's going on, and it elevates the action scenes, because these action scenes could just be generic MCU action scenes, guy driving a truck, running away from the bad guys, but what makes it so unique in the MCU, and I maintain these action scenes in the first couple episodes are some of the best in the MCU, because it's the disorientation. You don't know what's going on. So you have Steven waking up in the middle of an action scene. That's awesome. I believe what I wrote in my notes is that episode 1 is manic, and I think that that's not a bad thing. It's chaotic, and I love it. Episode 2, I think, is much the same, although maybe not quite as good. As we get to learn more about Mark, I think that the use of mirrors is a really clever and very well executed trick to sort of get both Oscar Isaac's, I guess, both of their performances. It's one guy, but it's, his dual performances, Mark and Steven, together. That works very well. But we're sort of getting into the meat of the plot, and this is where some of Moon Knight kind of falls apart for me a little bit. It's not enough to sink an episode or anything like that, but the cheesy nature of the show, the MCU kind of corniness kind of comes out a little bit. Like when Steven is doing his dance and he turns into the suit, Mr. Knight, it's not the best thing in the show for sure. I think Layla is fine. I think that I'm always going to butcher her last name, but the actress playing Layla, I think that she does a great job. I think she's more charismatic at the beginning because later on in the series, they're asking her to pull a lot more dramatic weight, as we'll talk about with Mark and Layla and their marriage, and then also Layla's father. They're asking her to do a lot as a character. And so I understand that it's maybe not as easy for an actor to pull that kind of thing off. But towards the beginning, when it's just Layla kind of being mad at Mark, I think that works. And then we move on to episode 3 where they're in Egypt. So by now, the show is establishing itself, and I think episode 2, while being a step down from episode 1, is still very solid. But then they head to Egypt, and the show, again, just sort of sinks its teeth into the parts of itself that I don't think work as well. I think that the adventuring aspect is maybe not what I signed up for Moon Knight Season 1. I was really on board for the psychological thriller, so to go to Egypt and turn it into Indiana Jones is cool and all, but it's maybe not what was the most appealing part at the beginning. And yes, let's talk about the Jake Lockley scene where Jake takes over and kills a bunch of guys. That's incredibly cool, by the way. I think that's such an amazing way to handle a character where you have all these different personas, and it keeps us on our toes. Unfortunately, they never explain him. Ever. It's just left on a cliffhanger. And that's one of the most frustrating parts of this entire show. It's just that they felt like, no, we're good. We're good to just have Jake kind of be there and not talk about him until the very end. And literally, I mean the very end. Although, I think it's in episode 3, the scene where Mark is in front of all the Egyptian gods and he says he's unwell. That's actually one of the better moments in the show where it shows Oscar Isaac's ability to act. And he's doing crazy things in that scene. He's acting as Khonshu, so he's pretending he's being possessed by Khonshu to speak, and he's yelling and screaming and then doubling over in pain, and then the gods ask him, "Are you unwell?" And he's crying. I think that's really a showcase for Oscar Isaac's acting talents for sure. I guess as episode 3 kind of wraps up, it's as good of a time as any to talk about Arthur Harrow. He's a fine villain. I think he falls into the bucket of charismatic actor. Ethan Hawke is amazing in the role, just like Cate Blanchett was so charismatic in the role of Hela. And I think Kurt Russell was very charismatic as Ego. But some of these villains just don't have the most compelling arcs. I think that the philosophy behind these characters, where one is serving a god who wants to punish people before they've committed the sin, while another is serving a god who wants to have vengeance after the fact, that's interesting, but it doesn't quite translate to the characters themselves. So Arthur just kind of comes off as a cult leader, which Ethan Hawke does a very good job of playing. And then we get into episode 4, and this episode is just confusing to me because I appreciate the Indiana Jones kind of aspects of this episode, the artifact hunting, but the show has this tonal whiplash, and really that's no pun intended, but I think that just having these zombie creatures come out of the middle of the tomb where they're searching for the artifacts and looking for the key to summoning Amit, it doesn't feel like it's part of the same show that I was watching in episode 1, and that's a little jarring when you're watching this whole series in one go, which is a difference between this rewatch and the initial watch, right, where it was coming out episode by episode, week by week. So while I think episode 4 is fun and fine on its own, where they're going into the tomb, I think, and looking for the Ushapti, is that what you call it? Doesn't feel like it's part of the show. And then leading into episode 5, that episode really doesn't feel like it's part of the show. But I will say, quality-wise, it feels like they put all of their emotional weight and all of their writing prowess and skill into episode 5. And I have to commend them for that, because episode 5 is one of the heaviest, darkest, most poignant episodes, even scenes, moments of the MCU ever. And I know I've been saying that a lot because it's true. Each series of the MCU thus far in Phase 4 has had its moments. Every single one of them. Even The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, a series that I don't love, but it has its moments. And this episode 5 of Moon Knight is incredible. I know they're kind of copying the format of WandaVision where you're going back through your past and reliving your trauma. I get that. It does bother me a little bit that they just did the exact same thing, basically. And the whole CGI hippo is not great. CGI crocodile is less great in episode 6. But I think what makes this work is Oscar Isaac. And that's what I can say about this entire show. It's Oscar Isaac. It's a driving force, right? He is a force to be reckoned with in this show, because the amount that he has to invest into this role is outstandingly large. And so to see his pain just shifting back and forth between Mark and Steven and seeing the pain that he feels when he sees his mother in the flashbacks and he sees his father in the flashbacks and relives the trauma of letting his brother die unintentionally. It's painful, it's heavy, it's poignant, but you understand the reconciliation that happens at the end of this episode. Which then leads into episode 6, which is well, it's CGI crocodile versus CGI bird, and it's Moon Knight versus Harrow. Ethan Hawke standing in front of a green screen just pointing a stick at nothing, which is what I'm assuming happened. And the sad thing is we don't even get to see Ethan Hawke get defeated because it happens by the hands of Jake Lockley. So again, it's a show that felt like at times it knew exactly what it was doing, and it did in episode 1 and episode 5. And then it's a show at times like in episode 6 where it kind of felt like it was both too smart for its own good and too MCU for its own good. And that's a real shame. It's a real shame. Because I came out of this show liking it significantly less than I did the first time. Now, do I hate this show? No. And like I've mentioned before, if you've been listening through the entire video, by the way, thank you so much. But I think episode 1 and episode 5 are probably 2 of the highest ranked MCU Disney Plus episodes in my head. Like, if I had to rank every single episode of the MCU Disney Plus shows, I think both of them would be in the top 5. But it's not enough to kind of carry the series where it needs to go. And the series had lofty goals, lofty ambitions. But at the end of the day, I mean, what else can I say except Oscar Isaac is amazing in it? But I mean, everyone says that because it's true. I mean, it's not factual. Obviously, you might hate Oscar Isaac in it, but I think Oscar Isaac gave it his all. And I can commend him for that. And he's a character that I want to see in the future. One thing I will say about episode 6 is that the reconciliation between Mark and Steven, where they're kind of flipping back and forth between the suits, I would love to see that in the MCU. They're just confusing the heck out of everybody, all the Avengers. And then I don't know what to do with Jake. So it's a show that I think I would love to see a season 2 of. I think so. But it's a show that I wish just resolved what it needed to resolve and took time to flesh itself out before it had moved on to another season or a future MCU appearance. And frankly, I have no idea even where he's going to appear in the MCU next. So we'll have to see about that. This video is recorded probably a long time before the video actually comes out. So if he has shown up in the MCU since then, well, there you go. So those are my thoughts on Moon Knight upon a re-examination. What do you guys think of this show? Let me know in the comments down below. If you haven't subscribed to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, make sure to do so. Give this video a like, and I will see you guys in the next one.